flee it. They try to distract themselves from it. They sit down with Haagen-Dazs. They try and go out and get a conversation going with a friend. They try to read a novel. They drink too much alcohol. They do whatever they can so that they don't feel bad, lonely, depressed, whatever the pain is, whatever the suffering is, guilty, whatever it is, instead of actually listening to what it's trying to tell you, because this discomfort has a story to tell. Just like when you step on a tack, the story it has to tell is there's a foreign object now that is lodged in the bottom of your foot that urgently requires removal. Suffering is telling you that there are adaptations to life and reality that you have not made. Suffering is telling you that there are adaptations to life and reality that you have not made, that you urgently need to make. But we do not learn these lessons because we don't listen to our suffering, because what is it? We see suffering as simply an evil. There is nothing in it of any value, and therefore it stays with us like a shadow. It follows us through our lives. We don't overcome suffering. We don't work through suffering. We simply we have bouts that we try to ward off and avoid as much as possible. And what this does is it leads to an enormous contraction of the world that we live in as our options become fewer and fewer. How about metaconsciousness?
Is that kind of realizing that you're suffering and being aware of it and trying to fix it?
Metaconsciousness in general, that would be a form of it. Metaconsciousness in general is your vigilant awareness of what is going on with your own mind. Most people do not attend to what is going on with their own mind. Most people aren't always conscious of their own motives, their own passions, their own feelings, their own attitudes, their own moods, their own inclinations, because they get distracted by the external affairs of the day. They get distracted by other things, and we're not in the habit of attending very, very closely to our own minds. That's what Socrates is saying when he says the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, you have to cultivate a kind of metaconsciousness so that when you have thoughts, you know very clearly what they are, because you're not distracted by all these other things. It's a habit of attending to the contents of your own mind, of your own consciousness. Now, did you catch the goal of Jungian psychology? Because the first, metaconsciousness, is directly related to this second. What I'm showing you is that the teachings of Epictetus in the 1st century AD, he was a contemporary, he was not quite, but he was almost a contemporary of Christ, that the teachings of Epictetus in the 1st century are contained in contemporary psychology. What is the goal of Jungian psychology? And what does it have to do with metaconsciousness? Yeah, try to press your mic if you can. That's okay, but try to press your mic if you can. It is making conscious what is unconscious, because that which remains unconscious remains out of your control and becomes your destiny. So, let me take an extreme case. You have people with obsessive compulsive disorder, and they do not know why they go through all these rituals every day and waste all this time. But they go back to the house 15 times to check to make sure they turned off the stove. They go back to the house 15 times to make sure that they remember to lock the door, and they don't know why this is happening to them. And Jung would say it's because there is something unconscious that is driving their behavior. Why do I do what I do? Why do I make the mistakes that I make? Why do I meet the people that I meet? Why do I fall into these patterns of behavior? Why is there this refrain in my life that keeps repeating? Well, the very fact that you're asking the question why means that the answer is unconscious, and it's something you haven't made conscious. And the simple process of making the unconscious conscious is the cure. That is the cure. Epictetus is suggesting this, and contemporary therapy, that is the entire goal, or it's a big part of it, of the goal. So Carlyle says, and Epictetus says, suffering is not evil. We do not realize that the greatest lessons of life are learned through suffering. If you look at sacred literature the world over, the so-called wisdom traditions or religious traditions the world over, we'll take our own here in the West, you find people who have to pass through trial. So you have Joseph of the multicolored coat, who's enslaved by his brothers, ends up in Egyptian prison, and has to endure all of this suffering before he can finally emerge as a full, complete human being. You have David, the king of Israel, who has this, has a man killed, takes his wife Bathsheba, and then has to suffer from his own children before he learns real wisdom. Nathan the prophet has to tell him, he has to realize, do you know what you've done? Do you know what you've done? And then he realizes. This is true of sacred literature all over the world. This is true of sacred literature all over the world. People who spend their lives avoiding suffering never change. They never grow up. They remain as brutal and as undeveloped as they were as children. As a matter of fact, they usually get worse because they haven't listened to suffering. Suffering is not something to be avoided. Suffering is something to be understood, not avoided. Nobody avoids suffering. As a matter of fact, the more you try to avoid suffering, the more suffering you will bring upon yourself. It's only people who walk through the suffering who emerge on the other side. So Epictetus says, look, if we're going to live well and wisely, we have to understand about power. But power over what? Who caught that? If somebody caught it, touch your microphone and speak. If you have a mic. If you don't have a mic, just speak up. Yeah.
Power over our metaconscious?
Epictetus says you do not have much power over your body. You can get sick. You can get cancer, leukemia. You can be crippled. You could be hit by something. There could be an accident. You don't have control over whether you're physically attractive or not. Epictetus is living, of course, long before the days of plastic surgery. You don't have control over the external world. People are going to like you or they're not going to like you. You can try and get them to like you. But people are going to like you or they're not going to like you. There are going to be good times, there are going to be bad times. You can't control circumstances. But one thing over which you have complete control is your own quality of consciousness. One thing, according to Epictetus, over which you have complete control is your own quality of consciousness. You have, if you can exercise metaconsciousness, you have a choice. You can cultivate one way of thinking, a positive, healthy way of thinking, or you can cultivate a negative, destructive way of thinking. Habits of thought are cultivated. You look at a garden, and you can focus on the weeds, or you can focus on the flowers, and there's a very real consequence for the choice that you make. There is a very real consequence for the choice that you make. Habits of thought are cultivated. Thinking that lends itself to compassion is cultivated. Thinking that lends itself to generosity is cultivated. Thinking that lends itself to nobility, courage, can be cultivated. Obviously it's cultivated because our family instilled habits of thinking into us. You weren't born courageous. You weren't born magnanimous. You weren't born heroic. Your families trained you in certain styles of thinking. And if you came from a deeply negative, pessimistic, cynical, depressive kind of family, the odds are overwhelming that you probably have those habits of thought. But those habits of thought are not permanent, neurologically fixed features of your mind. They are alterable. And people alter them all the time, but not without changing and not without knowing what they're doing. Not without knowing what they're doing, and not without metaconsciousness. Because people who are negative tend to think that they're negative for a reason. Why? Because they're thinking the truth about reality. Things suck. And I see it. And that's the truth. Whereas someone who thinks otherwise doesn't see that truth, quote-unquote truth, around them in the world. So Epictetus says you have power over your own mind, over your own consciousness, the quality of your own consciousness and the quality of your own experience. But you do not have power over whether somebody commits an act of injustice against you, somebody dislikes you, whether your body falls apart, whether you're good looking or you're not good looking. And what about acceptance? Yes.
Isn't it kind of, I guess, accepting the way you are and changing what you can? Is that being close to it?
Exactly. Epictetus says, if you know that you only have power over your own quality of experience, that is what you intervene to change. And you leave the externals alone. He's not saying stop exercising. He's not saying stop trying to make a good impression. He's saying, though, recognize that you don't pin your well-being and your happiness to that. Recognize that your principal concern is always who you are, what kind of person you are. And these are questions of mind. What are my attitudes? What are my characteristic ways of thinking? And you will find that attitudes and moods always follow characteristic ways of thinking. You don't get angry for no reason. The thought comes first. That son of a bitch cut me off. And then you get angry. That person snubbed me. And then you get angry. That was unfair. And then you get angry. So if you simply address your thought, you can change profoundly the quality of your own experience. And then the externals don't matter. What do the externals matter if you're profoundly, deeply tranquil and have a really deep sense, abiding sense of well-being? They won't. They don't. Because that's what people are after. And when people go out and they try and find these stimulating things in the external world, they're looking for substitutes. When people go out and get drunk, when people go out and have wild parties, they're looking for substitutes. They're really cheap substitutes.
Mr. McCarty?
Yes.
Could you stop banging on your desk, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. They're looking for cheap substitutes for genuine happiness. That's what they're looking for. When people shack up with other folks, or when people grab onto boyfriends and girlfriends and they move too fast, they're looking for substitutes, fast substitutes for genuine happiness. And that's why, like serial philanderers, that's why people who have spent all the years of their 20s moving from the bed of one stranger to the bed of another often feel deeply, profoundly empty. Because those are not the things that make you happy. Epictetus knew that. They're substitutes for happiness.
It's not the gaze.
No. Well, the gaze enters into it because we have this media-produced idea of what happiness should be and what it includes, and the media's produced this idea that the more people you sleep with, the happier you're going to be.
I feel sorry for people like that because they don't know what they're missing out on.
I feel sorry for people like that because they don't know that they've lost themselves.
Yeah.
They have no self. They've turned themselves over to circumstances. They've turned themselves over to what they can rip and run with, what they can grab off from the external world and run with. They tend to be selfish, self-absorbed, and infantile. They think that happiness consists in cars, jobs, other people, the right friends, the right look, whatever, or how smart you are, whatever it is, and it has nothing to do with any of that. They have no self. They're all externalized. And they spend their lives trying to orchestrate circumstances, to manipulate circumstances,